Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, coming to you from Gadigal Land. This is ABC News Daily. We love watching them, especially when we're winning gold, but Dan Andrews thinks they're too expensive. And by cancelling the Commonwealth Games in Victoria in 2026, the Premier may have damaged the event for good. Today, National Sport reporter David Mark on the anger the decision sparked and what it means for our sporting reputation. David Mark, you better explain where you are at the moment because it's rather noisy.
Yeah, Sam, I'm in New Zealand for the Women's Football World Cup. So half of the competition is taking place in New Zealand. So I'm right in the centre of Auckland at the moment doing a bit of filming, which is why you're hearing a bit of background noise.
Okay, so you're covering one big sporting event, but we're going to talk about a different one, of course, because Dan Andrews has made a bit of a shock decision.
We have informed Commonwealth Games authorities of our decision to seek to terminate the contract and to not host the Games.
What did you think when you heard that?
I was floored. I started getting a few messages saying, can you do a cross about the Commonwealth Games being cancelled? And I said, what? I was completely taken by surprise that he'd made that announcement. I mean, it was only a year or so ago that he announced that regional Victoria was going to host the Commonwealth Games.
Yes.
And what a massive boon it was going to be for Victoria and for regional centres in Victoria.
Well, thank you, Dame Louise. That is fantastic news for every Victorian, for our state. These will be a Commonwealth Games like no other. It'll cost a substantial amount, let's not be in any doubt about that, but I don't see it as a cost. I see it as a profound investment in showcasing to the world the best part of regional Australia.
To turn around just a little over a year later and saying it's going to cost too much money and we're going to cancel it is an extraordinary decision, and it leaves the Commonwealth Games in a really precarious position.
Yeah, so Dan Andrews, back then when he announced that regional Victoria would be hosting the Games, the costs didn't seem to faze him at that point, David, but it really does now. This is all about money, he says. So what has happened?
Well, initially he said the cost was going to be around $2.7 billion, but he came out and said, in fact, it looks like it's going to blow out to $7 billion and they can't afford it.
$6 to $7 billion is well and truly too much for a 12-day sporting event. I will not take money out of hospitals and schools in order to fund an event that is 3 times the cost as estimated and budgeted for last year.
It really is extraordinary because it raises a whole lot of questions. Why didn't you get the numbers right when you were bidding for the Commonwealth Games? How is it that you can estimate that something is going to cost $2.7 billion and then turn around a little over a year later and say it's going to cost more than twice that amount, 3 times that amount? Seems extraordinary.
Extraordinary, all right. And the head of the Commonwealth Games here in Australia, Craig Phillips, he's scathing on that point. He's really angry.
The Victorian government has jeopardised Melbourne and Victoria's standing as a sporting capital of the world. The stated cost overruns, in our opinion, are a gross exaggeration and not reflective of the operational costs presented to the Victorian 2026 Organising Committee Board as recently as June.
There's also, the repercussions for all those regional areas who might have been relying on that money coming in to boost infrastructure in their region. Well, that's not going to happen now, and there's been some comments from some regional mayors and so on to say that they're really pretty unhappy about the situation. So, yeah, it just seems strange. We all know that things have cost more after COVID, but when something's costing 3 times more than what you'd estimated, yeah, it's very, very bizarre.
Yeah, the Mayor of Ballarat, Des Hudson, he's been speaking about his disappointment in this.
In terms of the announcement today, that came as a surprise, but the cost blowout of that out to beyond $6 to potentially $7 billion ultimately comes out of taxpayer money.
And of course, the Victorian opposition leader, John Pesutto, he's lashed out at the decision, saying it's an absolute betrayal of regional Victoria.
And it's a massive humiliation for our great state. We have always prided ourselves on being a global events capital, and this is an utter humiliation that may well cost us as a state going forward.
The Deputy Premier, Jacinta Allen, she's the minister responsible for the Games. She confirmed there will be a support package worth $2 billion to compensate these regional communities. Do you reckon that's enough, David?
Well, I mean, look, they're going to get some infrastructure, I suppose, if the Victorian government actually does follow through with that promise and, delivers the money to build those sort of things. But they're obviously not going to be at the same sort of level that they would have been in order to host a Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games is still a pretty big ticket item. I was at the Birmingham Commonwealth Games last year, and the infrastructure there was pretty good. You're hosting a lot of countries from around the world, a lot of spectators, so it can't just be sort of a country, basketball stadium. It's got to be better than that. Look, they're certainly not going to get the infrastructure they were going to get. They're not going to get the sort of publicity that they were going to get. They're not going to be shown or put on the map in the way that they would have been had the Commonwealth Games been coming to those areas, the likes of Ballarat, Bendigo and Shepparton and so on. So
it has this flow-on effect for regional communities, but also, David, for the athletes. The former Olympic gold medalist, Kieran Perkins, he says it's a decision that could actually hinder the careers of emerging athletes as well.
That pathway that it gives them, that experience, the knowledge and the opportunity then to springboard into bigger and better things in their career is definitely going to be impactful with the loss of these games, especially if another host nation is not found.
It really must be devastating for those people who were expecting to compete at these Commonwealth Games.
That's right. You hear athletes say constantly that one of the great privileges of being an athlete is being able to perform in front of your friends and family. So a home games is something really special for athletes. So for all those athletes who were excited about, representing Australia in Australia, and particularly those that might have come from some of those regional communities, incredibly disappointing.
So I am gobsmacked, I'm floored, I'm disappointed for our athletes.
I was really looking forward to competing in front of a home crowd.
And so really it can be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for family and friends who put in so much time and effort and money into our careers. It's upsetting.
So for them, it'll be incredibly disappointing. And of course, now we just wait to see what's going to happen to these Commonwealth Games if another country can pick up the 2026 Commonwealth Games.
Yeah, so that remains to be seen. I do note that apparently we've hosted more Commonwealth Games than any other nation. As you said, the last time in 2018, that was the 5th time we've had them here, so we kind of like them, right?
Australia loves the Commonwealth Games because Australia does very well at the Commonwealth Games, and that was the case just last year in Birmingham, where Australia absolutely scooped the pool. I mean, it was a gold medal fest, and it seems that Australians never get tired of seeing Australian athletes win gold medals. So I think that is one reason too. And I guess there's that sentimentality around the Commonwealth Games, That being said, there's also a real debate about the Games because in some senses it can be seen as, a sort of an anachronism. What role does the Commonwealth have in the modern world? What role does Australia have in the Commonwealth? That being said, having been at the Commonwealth Games last year in Birmingham, they were incredibly popular and all the athletes had a great time, as did the spectators.
Do these events actually make money for governments?
No, they don't. They almost always make a loss. The return on investment is basically, seen as, well, we've got this infrastructure for the future. We've got the advertising because our city is on the world stage. Obviously, there's tourism that flows through from those things at the time. But I think the real value, if there is a real value, comes in the longer term sort of publicity and infrastructure that creates, but it's often hard to sort of do the accounting to work out exactly how that, pays off and over what sort of time period that pays off. But, it's pretty much the case that those organisations or those cities don't make money in the short term from the huge outlay of putting on a major event like a Commonwealth Games or an Olympic Games.
Okay, well, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he was sort of asked about this. He didn't want to say too much, I don't think.
Look, that's a decision made by the Victorian government. I'll leave the Victorian government.
Does this decision, David, do you think, reflect on other competitions and the money we spend on those big sporting events? I mean, you're covering the Women's World Cup at the moment. That's a big, big event. What about the Olympics? Do we just not have in this nation the cash flow needed for these big sporting events anymore?
They are extraordinarily expensive to put on. And I actually thought when Victoria announced that it was going to host the Commonwealth Games by sharing it out amongst 5 regional centres, I thought, well, that's got to be the future because it's cost so much money for one city to stage a major sporting event like the Commonwealth Games. Even though it's nowhere near the ballpark of an Olympic Games, it's still a very big event. And so I thought, well, maybe this is the answer. The Commonwealth Games is almost certainly has to shrink. It can't be as big as it's always been because no city really can, put up that sort of infrastructure time and again, or even for a one-off event. It costs so much money. But the fact that Victoria has now pulled the pin raises real questions about it. And we've seen with the Olympic Games, I mean, the costs are just extraordinary, and it just is causing real food for thought amongst a whole lot of nations and cities about whether they bid. And we've got the situation with the Brisbane and the South East Queensland Olympic Games now, that it was really down to just that one area, that was the only bid when it came down to it, and even then it's going to be shared amongst Brisbane and the Gold Coast. So I think it's going to create real doubt about the future of the Commonwealth Games. Perhaps there's a city that can step up, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, so what do you think the chances are of that another nation could step in at this point?
I don't know. I really don't know, and I'm going to be really interested to find out because these things are big events and they take a lot of lead-in. You've got to have all the infrastructure, the public service kind of infrastructure in place for one. I mean, Dan Andrews had to tell all those people who were working on the Commonwealth Games that essentially they were out of a job. So you have to have a city that's prepared to do it, and then you've got to make sure you've got all the venues and all the other things that work around it, the public transport, make sure there's enough hotel rooms. It's a big logistical exercise, and we're going to see, you've got 3 years to go. Is someone going to put up their hands? Well, it's a very big ask.
Okay, so tell me, David, what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end of the Commonwealth Games?
Yeah, I do. I do think that's the case. For a city to suddenly have to scramble to put together a Commonwealth Games, well, we just don't know if that's going to happen. And if it doesn't, what happens then? Do they postpone it? Do they call it off this time and do it again in 7 years? Who knows? But it's a real dilemma.
David Mark is the ABC's national sports reporter. The Commonwealth Games Federation had struggled to find a host city before Victoria volunteered. The Federation says it's hugely disappointing and it's committed to finding a solution. This episode was produced by Veronica App, Anna John, Laura Corrigan, Sam Dunn and Flint Duxfield, who also did the mix. Our supervising producer is David Cody. Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to listen to more free podcasts or download the ABC Listen app and stream ad-free.